IVM.
Welcome to the most listened to South Asian radio station on the planet. Ruckus Avenue Radio.
Hello, people of the world. This is Amit Doshi from IVM. We are India's premier podcasting network, and we're so happy to be on Ruckus Radio and hope to have you join us every week at this time when we bring you segments from the best of our shows. We hope you tune into the entire episodes on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This week on Cyrus Says, he was joined by Devdutt Patnaik, mythologist, speaker, illustrator, columnist, and author. They spoke about how mythology has so much for us to learn from and how it's never been about religion. It's a way of life and having the right virtues. All stories are an ocean of knowledge, and one can draw parallels in different aspects of life for us to apply.
Let's introduce our guest. Devdutt Patnaik, the legend, is here. A man who charges just to discuss mythology with you on a plane 4 lakhs. I mean, just to say, bro, just tell me this Ram, Lakshman, and the girl's name is Sita. Just for that, I had to pay 4 lakhs. That's how big he is right now. No, but jokes apart, I think Devdutt has now created a niche separate from anybody else. There are a few trying to follow him, but there's only one original, where he can take you from a corporate position to a mythological position and draw parallels, analogies, and metaphors for the betterment of society. So he's the rare Indian who uses mythology, Hinduism, if you like, religions of all kinds, to bring peace. To find love and hope. Very rare, very odd thing. I don't know why he's doing that. You've got a powerful tool like religion. You must use it to exercise power, young man. But we'll find out all about that. Devdutt, welcome to the show. Your biography, I've got it here, is too long. It'll take me years to read. So, and we have to discuss you as a person, which is more important because they can Google all the references here. But let's start with this. You're also a doctor. People don't know that. You're a trained medical professional. So this will be a great year for you. You can actually do a show and help the people dying at the same time.
No, I did my medicine in Grand Medical College, JJ, about long time ago, long time. And but I didn't practice. I was in the pharma.
No, Devdutt, I've got news for you because Google can't be wrong. It says that you actually spent as many as 15 years in the healthcare and pharma business. You're a proper medical practitioner.
Yeah. I worked in the hospital business and I worked in the pharma business. So not actually treating patients, but working in the medical, all the medicines that we take at the hospitals. So I worked in the industry, but not as a clinician. I was not a clinician.
But that means today, if you were working 15 years ago, work was now, you'd be actually working on the vaccine.
I could be working on marketing the vaccine, selling the vaccine, training the vaccine, but not actually creating the vaccine or giving those jabs.
Yeah, you just don't want to make sure there's no legal issues later so that you're not responsible for the vaccine when the side effects start in 2024, when men develop the fourth nipple and things like that. Oh, it's going to happen. It's going to be fun. Okay, so we'll start right there. But so you were very much entrenched in the workspace in healthcare because 15 years is a long time. Obviously, we'll understand that there's a side of you that loves mythology and all, but it was not a professional side. You were just enjoying it and you got a learned mind, etc., etc. So how did the thing happen where the guy who's working in a proper business in healthcare would suddenly turn profession at what age was it?
So around 38, 40, I turned.
Wow. That at that age, all Bollywood actresses are finished. And you started a second avatar. Wow, fantastic. So let me I'm asking all the wrong questions. I'm an idiot. But if you go back a little bit, when did you just give us an idea of how you knew you could do something with this other side to you, which was by and large like, not a professional side in the sense that you weren't earning money through it, but you were a person interested in the subject.
So I was interested in the subject, yes. And initially when I wrote my first book, I thought it will sell millions of copies and I won't have to work for the rest of my life. Then, of course, it only sold 200 copies and the rude realization came that it doesn't happen like that. And I realized, the world was very difficult. People say they are interested in the subject, but nobody really goes to a bookshop and buys books.
Is it like the way Is it like the way they talk about National Geographic, but they all want to show that they have interest in nature and environment and all these causes, but actually don't really watch anything? So it's similar.
Yeah, because they have all these exotic ideas, and when you tell them, but this is not there in any book. Like for example, Ram having a six-pack ab or a Shiva having a six-pack ab. I said, I have never seen this anywhere, read anywhere. Even Ganesh now has a six-pack ab. Very clearly it is told that he has a big tummy. He has to be round and fat. But even he has become a six-pack ab guy now, which is so sad. So what happened?
Look at our rants. Your rant today is about mythology and six-pack abs, having no reference there, and people hijacking it and saying all the gods have these perfect bodies. My rant, of course, is about the mask should never be cleaned. I'm just trying to show who's going to listen to this podcast. All right. Sorry. So you were saying, so all these myths about myths. What an irony that is.
So I was reading up and I was actually reading the subject. And then over time, it was something that I loved to do in my weekends. And I would share it with my friends who loved it. And then it just so happened that Economic Times wanted a column in their corporate. I was just talking in a friend's house about how it is connected to management, how everything is read mythology. And he liked the idea. He said, why don't you write a few columns for me? And that was supposed to be only 6 columns in about 20 years ago. But it became such a hit that it's even now it's continuing in a way. So it's over 20 years.
What was the first column? The very first thing you wrote?
I wrote something in my first column.
In Economic Times. Huh.
Well, my first column was related to the loks, the various jo Devlok hota hai. There is Devlok, there is Asurlok.
Oh, the
so
loks,
I was comparing that with business and life. How you have the boss's cabin upstairs, and then there are the workers downstairs, and and really the
hierarchy basically.
Hierarchy of society. So South Bombay, North Bombay, Mumbai.
What's the Bombay hierarchy quickly, now that you mentioned it? Who's the
I
apex?
don't know which direction is Devlok actually. Whether
it doesn't matter. You'll be stuck in traffic or potholes or work or infrastructure repair work. So don't worry. It doesn't really matter.
That Bombay makes everybody equal that way.
Leveling factor.
The pothole doesn't.
Really. And whether you're a god or not, it doesn't matter. You still are stuck in traffic. Yeah. But did you realize that when you wrote that first column, it's such a great concept in terms of corporate culture, which of course you got to exploit later. But I'm saying you mustn't have known. You just wrote this as a idea about how you marry corporate with mythology. But did you have any idea at that point that it'll roll out to be this huge juggernaut?
I was starting to see the pattern. See, initially I thought mythology has nothing to do with day-to-day life. It was just something to enjoy. I used to enjoy it as something nothing to do with life. But the deeper I went into it, it was very strange. As the deeper I went, I realized I was talking about my life, my issues. Then I would share it with my friends. They would say, hey, these are my issues. These are my problems. And then I realized that I was solving day-to-day issues and helping people. I would always give examples from mythologies, which people found very exciting. And I just turned that into articles. So basically, everything that I saw in the scriptures, I realized was helping my life. I was getting a better person. I was becoming better at work. And I was just sharing. So whatever I write is basically my personal experience. I realize when you read the Vedas, when people keep saying, oh my God, Veda is so complicated. It's not complicated. It is talking about gods who are hungry. They want something and they will not give you something unless you give them something. And then you realize that's like any trade and business, right? Nobody's going to give you something if you don't give them something back.
No free lunch.
And no free lunch. There is no such thing. They'll keep saying that, when you go to the temple, they'll say, nahi, kuch haath mein leke jana chahiye. You should take something to the temple. Why do you take something to your temple? Because there is this notion of give and take.
Give and take.
And this is something that is very fundamental. But when people say yajna, everybody wants things to be exotic. I think all these gurujis also love to make it all magical and mystical. It's not magical and mystical. It's just day-to-day life. And that's what I do. I bring it down to basics. I'm not interested in the exotic muscle people and all those people wearing those fancy clothes. That's packaging.
What you're saying is that people are looking less at the philosophy and what is inside and more the outside, the shell. More interested in the look and the hair length and the abs and this and that and fighting over that.
Which is what life is, right? People get fascinated by, good-looking people or something. And really what matters is, do you connect with that person? Is he a nice person? A good-looking person can be a nice person, can be a nasty person. An ugly person can be a nice person, can be a nasty person. What you really need is nice people around you. And it is nice if they're good-looking. It is an added bonus to have someone good-looking and healthy around you. But nice people are nice people and you want nice people around you. And exactly same thing applies to gods and goddesses.
It upsets me a little bit, Devdutt, because you're against shallow philosophies and I'm all for shallow philosophies. I don't know why you people come here with your beautifully constructed, honest humanitarian thought and spoil what is a really low hanging fruit as far as the podcast should be. You didn't tell us one thing though. How did Devdutt Pattanaik look at the bachpan ka situation or whatever. How did you know all this? Because obviously there's something in the background, the family.
No, my parents, my family didn't feel this was funny at all. They said you're, typical, like, तुमने पढ़ाई की, अभी job करो. And can you imagine if someone who studied medicine, and I even gave my UPSC exams and got through, and I said, no, I don't want to do this. And my parents are like, what are you going to do? Ramayana, Mahabharata? Are you mad? So someone in Chembur, and you're like, I'm reading Ramayana, Mahabharata. On the other side, there is medical textbooks, Grey's Anatomy and all that. And they're like, what's wrong with you? Like, this is not normal. But then, I have never been that way. I don't like
the word normal. Yeah, it's overrated. I agree with you. But what I was actually trying to ask is, how did you get the knowledge? Or rather, what was the influences in your childhood and all that allowed you to have this? Because it was already there, organically speaking. You seem to have already had it on that before you became a writer, etc., etc.
Honestly, I realized it later. See, now, in hindsight, I realize that I'm a pattern thinker and I like to see patterns in everything. And that's what I do when I read a book, when I read a novel, even in my work. When I was good at my work, I would do, like, I entered management without any MBA, but I was good at it. I was good in business. I was good in I would immediately understand what the CEO wants, and I would understand, he doesn't want obedience. He just wants you to lick his ass and then you'll get ahead. So I knew exactly how to get ahead. So I knew that he doesn't care what the results are. So I realized people are complicated, and जो theory होता है, वो reality नहीं होता है. There is a big difference between theory and practice. People speeches what they give, and I would like because you're so that pattern thinking is very natural to me. And now I realize that I quickly figure out structures, and I do. At that time I was doing it intuitively. Nobody told me these words like structure. But I would just know it. Like, Ramayana mein ye problem hai, Mahabharata mein ye problem hai. The Bible is like that. And that is why Bible cannot be compared with Ramayana and Mahabharata because of these differences. And people would look at me as if I'm talking some strange language. So I said,
yeah, that could be controversial, but I know what you're saying. All you're doing is pointing out that different ways, and this is what the two books are saying or whatever. You're not making a judgment call per se. But people do. They misinterpret. They always want some sort of judgment. Also, what you're saying is that you basically, stoking the ego is more important. That's marketing. It's called the ego of the person above you in the hierarchy. That's 80% of the job. It's got nothing to do with actual market dynamics.
Yeah, see, I have a famous line when I give lectures, ki brand ka matlab kya hai? I like to give lectures in Hindi because it connects with the masses. And I say, brand ka matlab kya hai? And I say, औकात hi hai na. तो तुम Rolls Royce या Mercedes खरीदते हो, not because you can buy a small car which will take you in better in the small gullies of Bombay, but you will take a big car because तुम्हारी औकात ना, you want to show yourself. And that immediately the audience gets. ऐसे औकात होती है ना, मेरा गणपति तुमसे गणपति से बड़ा है, मेरा taller, bigger, fatter, all these.
Yeah, why?
And basically it is तुम्हारी औकात.
That's correct. Why do they have to fight with the Ganesh size? What's the deal with that?
So it is, our yearning to be dominating. It's an animal instinct. Na? See, you'll see animals. No, animals are innocent, right? Humans are not innocent, but animals are innocent, and they have a hierarchy. They'll be a big
alpha, yeah.
Dog. So humans humans are stupid. We still want to be like animals, and we still want to be alpha, which is very foolish. I mean, you're not an animal. वो हो गया तेरा, वो जन्म हो गया. Can you move on? But 99% of people cannot move on. We like being alpha. And honestly, it feels good. It feels good when people obey you. You love to be the master, dominating. It feels very good.
I hate it. But so without being cynical, Devdutt Pattanaik doesn't have a very great view about mankind in terms of the way we conduct ourselves.
Well, human beings, it's a struggle. Mankind is about getting rid of your animal side. And we are all struggling. It's not that nobody struggles. The question is, are you struggling?
I'm not criticizing. I'm with you. I'm totally with you. I also don't like human beings. I think you're right. It's a flawed concept.
No, I have no views that way. I would like people around me not to be animals.
I think Devdutt's lawyer has told him very clearly that at all points just stay in the middle because we're living in very strange times. In fact, before I just get into all the things you've done, I read your columns a lot. I'm sure many people listening, most people are fans of yours because, you sort of tell it like it is. You call out things. It's not like it's always going to be one-dimensional. The perspective is the way it is. So, but that is dangerous because there are certain ordained principles in our thinking from childhood and you question a lot of them, including the sexuality of gods. And I'm just thinking, what guts? It's really nice that you like a breath of fresh air. But is it a problem with, let's say, powers that be?
Powers that be come
as you got popular?
Every power and be come and goes. Na? Like 10 years ago, there were people who were very powerful. Today, nobody remembers them. Once upon a time in Bollywood, Rajesh Khanna was the greatest god on earth. Everybody adored him. He died unknown. Nobody
Sad,
remembers.
yeah.
Sad.
Letters in blood, love letters in blood to him and all.
Yeah, so that is today people are writing love letters to other people. Yeah, आते हैं जाते हैं. कोई बड़ी बात. Nobody is permanent in this world, and I think that is a reminder for me. And I don't call out things for being provocative or to catalyze people. I'm like, देखो ऐसा है, and I'm giving the logic for it. And of course, there's a risk. But if in life, if you don't take risks, if I didn't take risks, I wouldn't be where I am. So you take calculated risks. It is like you enter a cage where there's a tiger. And how do you deal with it? You have to manage the tiger carefully.
What kind of example is that? What kind of joker says, "Chalo, I'll go into the cage where the tiger is and hang out for 5 minutes"?
Have you met rich and powerful people? Most of them I have met behave like wild dogs who need rabies vaccine.
Wow. Oof.
Yeah, because half the time you're afraid if I say something, they'll get upset and they'll throw you out of their house. They'll put you in jail. They do an IT raid. So that is like dealing with a mad dog, right? You're like, oh my God, pata nahi kab mere upar kood padega. And remember, we are always, when we're writing a tweet or something, we keep saying freedom of expression, but actually we're dealing with mad dogs waiting to pounce on you. And that is the life we have now told that, yahan pe sab jagah rabid dogs hai. So I remind myself, whenever I go to some very rich, famous, powerful person, kitna security guards hai. That means he must be such a horrible person that people want to kill him.
Yeah. I agree with you totally. I wish you wouldn't attack my poor dogs in your references, but other than that, I agree with you totally. Yeah.
No, see, the dogs are innocent.
Yeah.
They behave because that is the only choice they have. Humans have other choices. You don't have to behave like a kutta. The kutta has no choice. That is the way it is. You can be a nice, orangutan. You can be a lovely goose. You can be a peacock. You can be a wolf. You can be a termite.
I just have to announce that Devdutt Pattanaik is now a naturologist, zoologist. We've switched from, but I want to ask you, because you were exactly what you're saying. See, some of your stuff can be seen to be very pro-Hindu. And then you have these guys saying, oh, Devdutt Pattanaik apna aadmi hai. He's talking about Hindu culture, Hindutva, this and the other. And suddenly you're given a symbol and now they give you the flag to carry. That's one problem, because I know that's not you. Then the other part is that you've taken a stance, you're opening flexible thoughts about certain great institutions in religion, and whether it's the Puranas, Vedas, whatever. Then you're looked as anti, because you're so, I mean, how do you, because you're neither. You're just always like a scholar looking at things which people like, I hope a lot of people do understand and enjoy about you, because you make us see it that way as well. But how do you deal with people who will suddenly say, he's our guy, or he's destroying our culture, because you're getting both?
See, we have to live with stupidity. No?
That's the podcast.
We have to be kind to stupid people and be a little careful of them. Kind because they need to become smart, and careful because in stupidity they can do stupid things. And, so we have to live with that society. It's like walking in a jungle. You'll see the reason I give animal references and plant references, because even the gods take the form of animals and plants, right? You will see Ganesha having an elephant head. Why are they saying? They're trying to remind us of those animal things. Shiva is riding a bull, Devi is riding a lion. Why are they constantly talking about plants? Bargat ka ped, this plant. Because they're trying to say, if you understand plants, you understand animals, you understand your humanity. And I am trying to be human. I don't want to be on anybody's side, or I want to carry a jhanda. Why do you want to carry a jhanda? And if I would carry a rainbow flag. I'm perfectly fine, because all colors are in it. I don't want to carry one color, orange or blue or purple. It doesn't matter. I like all colors. Depending on the mood, you have different colors, and you choose different colors. So you have to deal with the fact that we are walking in a forest. And I think life is, you're dealing with friendly animals, hostile animals, animals which want to eat you, animals that are afraid of you. So we deal with strange people. So whenever I see a person, I first see, okay, what kind of animal am I dealing with? And then I'm careful with them, friendly with them, gentle with them.
Then you watch an episode of Caesar Milan on how to handle that particular breed, and you take it from there. But the puritanical, what is the right word? The Victorian Puritans, those type of people who will, when you question sexuality of gods, or when you look drugs, Soma, I've read some articles of yours on, Bhang, Soma, these kind of things. You talk about how actually most of your talking, if I'm wrong, please tell me, is you show universality of everything. That you stop judging literally, because, we've got this as well in the spiritual texts as well as in material world. That kind of thought is very difficult for a Puritan to take. If we take sex or drugs, for example.
They are not Puritans. See, the word Puritan is wrong, that they are pure, because in their heads, not having sex is pure. Really, they're sad, because they've never had sex.
Losers. Not having sex.
Your life and you are telling how others should have sex. You realize how tragic it is. तू कभी सेक्स नहीं किया है और तू बोल रहा है मेरे को कैसे सेक्स करना चाहिए.
Exactly.
I'm like, are you? Like, anyway, there are foolish people, but I find them very amusing. And thousands of people believe that they are smart people because they've not had sex. I'm like, really? I mean, it's very tragic that they're denying a very natural bodily function. It's excretory fluid. And as a medical doctor, it's just excretory fluid. If you don't throw it out, somebody else will throw it out. And it is not a big deal. Nature doesn't care for your semen so much as you do.
So preserving is a waste of everybody's time, including your own.
And what are you doing? I mean, you're not calmed down.
Baba, they're not attractive enough. They're not getting dates, yaar. Tinder is not working. Wi-Fi problem. I don't know.
There's something called pornography. You can watch it on television.
No, you're telling me? Sir, that's my subject. One day you'll interview me on that. Yeah.
So, देखो, भगवान ने तुमको हाथ दिए हैं, तो तुम्हें दुख की कोई आवश्यकता नहीं है. You have got hands, so you really don't need compassion.
Okay, stop it. We figured it out. It sounded nice in Hindi. It sounds terrible in translation. I have to tell you. Language bhi ek cheez hai, bhai. No. So what, reading articles over the years and all, finding the fact that you're almost like a Westerner or a neutral from outside, because you're able to enjoy whatever you're talking about without A, being judgmental, and B, by looking at it from different perspectives. So we do, which I think is the best writers. That's what they do. Otherwise, what's the point of reading something you just sort of know yourself? So that, but in our country, where we are right now, I hate to go back to this point all the time. Do you now have to be a little more careful? Is it? Do you have to be a little wary when you take on sexuality, alcohol, drugs, unorthodox thought, certain things that you will talk about which are not done in, I won't use the word puritanical society, but in so-called orthodox society?
I'm not challenging anyone. I'm just sharing what I'm reading. They are feeling challenged. I don't challenge anyone because nobody's that important.
But if they talk to you backstage after your show, and I'm sure somebody engages with you in a civilized way, then how do you? Yeah.
Are they good looking?
Yeah. Okay.
Step one: if they're good looking, then I might engage and waste my time with them because I'm also shallow.
Fair enough.
Second, I check if they're interested. They're smart people. Then I will tell them. Then I can have a good conversation because stupidity can be reduced, smartness can be increased.
Yeah.
And third, are they paying me money?
Baba, you're like the brother I've always wanted. You're saying all the right things. Come home. Let's eat lunch.
You can catch the full episode on the IVM app, website, or your preferred podcast platform. And remember, Cyrus Says goes live every weekday morning at 10 a.m. India Standard Time. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook, and you can catch that right there. Time for a break. We'll be right back.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.
IVM.
Welcome back. Joining Karthik Nagarajan on the Filter Coffee podcast this week, we have Naveen Munjal, who is the managing director of the Hero Eco Group and Hero Electric Vehicles. After empowering India with quality two-wheeler vehicles for more than a decade, his next focus is electric vehicles. Frequently asked questions around electric vehicles, their scope and future in India, building charging points, training mechanics to handle them. These were some of the points they discussed in this episode.
I love the math, that you said at the beginning, which is, it's almost the cost of initial ownership. It's paid for by itself in the first year or second year of how much you save in fuel, right? So it's an absolute no-brainer from a cost perspective, isn't it? I want to slightly move, Mr. Munjal, this discussion to something you mentioned a lot in this previous answer, which is the battery, right? Yeah. The EV movement overall, globally, at least from a competition perspective, is becoming fast about the battery, right? Right from a Tesla to an Apple to everything that we see in the space, it's all becoming about the battery. And I know that you spend a lot of time, effort, and investment in R&D. How would you rate, Hero's as well as India's preparedness from an R&D perspective, especially in the battery and the form factor challenges that you have?
See, let's break it up into different forms of R&D or different R&Ds. So there's a lot of work that is going into R&D in India now. And this has begun in the last couple of years. And there's extensive amount of work going on, not just from our side, but numerous companies who are coming up with new innovative ideas. Now, in terms of the battery itself, even though we don't have the cell manufacturing in India at this point of time, but I'm confident that that's going to come in very soon in the near future. But when we look at it, India, our situation is a very unique situation. We are sitting in a very unique situation from a point of view of the usability of the vehicles. We have extensive heat, 45 plus degree temperature in most parts of the country. When it rains, it pours. We have potholes on the roads. Our electricity that we're getting is again not completely clean in different places all the time. So there are numerous challenges which exist. To overcome those challenges, we are constantly looking at innovations in batteries and in the BMS and how we really work around all of this, the chargers, etc. So just to give you an example, we introduced our lithium-ion batteries about 5-6 years back, but we are already in the 4th generation batteries. And even though we may not be manufacturing it, but we know what is to be done in terms of the chemistry, and we get that done from somebody else, because we believe right now that a specialist who's doing that is far better geared or more geared than us to be able to make that battery. We're not capable, or right now we don't have the capabilities of doing everything. And that, I believe, is going to be the case where you'll have specialist companies who are doing that specialist job for you, and it's cheaper for you and it's better for you to buy from them rather than having everything homegrown. That, I think that time is gone, where you would now look at more collaborations and partnerships. So there are numerous companies who are working on new battery chemistries, on new BMS, and how that battery reacts, and how we even go from a lithium-ion battery, what is right now, into solid-state batteries, and eventually then into something like a fuel cell, but that's a very far away application. It's become a very interesting industry now. We've always been working on how do we improvise our batteries and how do we improvise the product in order for various reasons, for the customer experience, for warranties, and for longevity of the battery and the longevity of this thing. And I'm happy to state that we are now at cutting edge in terms of the chemistries that we are using. I think it's a different chemistry to what majority of our competition is using. But nevertheless, we are far ahead in terms of, because of the knowledge that we've garnered over the past so many years of us being in this industry. So India is quite far ahead when it comes to R&D work that we are doing here. There are small outfits, there are large outfits. There's numerous companies who are doing a lot of work in this. And I'm pretty confident that whatever technologies that come out of India and are suitable for India are going to be actually leading edge, simply because of our environmental conditions are so difficult that the products that come out to be able to, if you can survive, if you can make it work in India effectively in a way that you can make it work anywhere. It's like the same example. If you can drive on the Indian roads, you can drive anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of an example that I'm using here, or that kind of an analogy. So India is doing a lot now in the last couple of years.
Yeah. We spoke about consumer challenges and some of the myths that we were talking about. One of the other areas is also in terms of design. Right. And, for the longest time, for whatever reason, electric vehicles that came out of India were not necessarily the prettiest or the most attractive ones. Right. But I see a big change in that happening. If you were to look at, A2B itself, your line in that you almost, I think in your communication is that we don't build electric cycles, we sculpt them. Right.
Yeah.
And that's been sort of a design philosophy across the board. What drives your views on design, and talk to us a little bit about how important you think that is?
Very important. Design is very, very, very important when it comes to it's got to be optimal for the customer, what they're looking at. So design is extremely important because that's the first feature that the customer looks at, whether I'm attracted to the design or not. If the customer is not attracted to the design, he's not going to test it out no matter how good the product is to ride. So first and foremost, you've got to bridge that gap of actually having a good, acceptable design. It may not be a perfect design, but it's an acceptable design where the customer is actually, or the consumer is willing to try it out. That's the primary one. The second factor is that the product itself has to perform flawlessly. It's got to be an outstanding product, because what you're competing against is a very well-established 100-year-old industry, which is very, very well entrenched. So you're trying to give a better experience than what the person would get from there. And the next factor is your reliability and your cost factors. So the product has got to be reliable. And it's got to be at a efficient, it's got to be, may not be the cheapest product, but it's got to be a very value sensitive product. So it's got to give you a good quality product at a certain value. Now, India, again, is unique in those concepts because here we are expecting the electric vehicle to be cheaper than a counterpart ICE engine vehicle. When you look at, for example, even our other ranges that we do internationally, the products are far more expensive than an ICE engine vehicle. I mean, the performance may be far lower, but yet they are far more expensive simply because of the design elements that we use and the technology that we use in the vehicle. India is a bit unique in that manner, where the design's got to be good, the performance has to be top-notch, the warranties have to be excellent. We are giving now a 5-year warranty on our vehicles, and the pricing has got to be very, very lucrative. To blend all of those together is something that has been a very tough one or a very interesting one for a country like India. We can't just plaster, we can't just pick up what we've got internationally and just put them, just plonk them here and say that, this is going to work because it's working so well internationally. We have our own unique experiences. We have our own unique challenges. And those we have to overcome by having a blend of all of these things together and at a price which is acceptable to the consumer.
You can catch the rest of this episode on the IVM website app or wherever you're listening to podcasts. Ever feel awkward about lending money to family and friends and after giving it, endlessly waiting for them to return it? The habit coach Ashton Doctor helps us with some principles that one should establish when doing so to avoid getting into conflict.
Hello and welcome to the Habit Coach Podcast, the bite-sized podcast filled with quick and easy, actionable habits. Remember, great habits create that awesome life. I am Ashton Doctor, your habit coach. And today's fun fact of the day has to do with lending systems. Did you know that the first official lending system started about 3,000 years ago in ancient Rome and Greece? This was the system that is used today by pawn shops or pawnbrokers. This is where someone gives you something of value that they own in return for money in exchange. A certain interest rate is also identified at the time of exchange. Once the money plus that interest rate has been returned, the pawn shop gives back that item of value it was holding. And after a stipulated time, if the money plus interest is not returned, the pawn shop sells off the item it has in possession to recover the money loaned out. This is where we often hear those horror stories of people losing their family jewels. Pun not intended, but where they put up their wife's jewelry for a loan and are then unable to pay it back. In India, we had the zamindar system, which was also like a form of lending, where the zamindar would give loans and in return the person would work in their fields to pay them back, or pay the zamindar in produce from that land. The problem with that system is that the zamindars would give loans at ridiculous rates, so high that the people could not pay that amount back and had to work their entire lives for it. And hence, the system turned into a form of slavery. What is important in all methods of lending is an interest rate. This is to protect the person giving the money. It is not a function of greed or, that wanting extra money. It is protection. Very often we are asked by our friends or family for money. Please give me this much and I will pay you back in a few months. We feel awkward about loaning our hard-earned money, but then they tell us this urgent story that they need it and without it things are going to be very difficult for them. So we then end up giving in and giving that loan to them. This is where most of our problems start. We wait eagerly for that day when they promise to give the money back. Yet that day comes and goes, no sign of the money. In your mind, you're wondering, how would you have invested that money? It would have earned you so much in return. Yet nothing, not a peep from them about the money. You suddenly hear that they bought a new car or they went on an international holiday. Now your blood is boiling. Bloody hell, they have money for a new car? No money to return their loan? You meet them at social events and act like everything's okay. Then you subtly try and tell them, about that money you have of mine. And they brush the topic aside and worse yet, get angry at you for bringing this topic up. Outside, you are smiling. Inside, you are boiling. Chances are you might never get that money back. If you are lucky, you will. But one thing is for sure, you have ruined a friendship, you have ruined a relationship, and caused yourself unnecessary stress. As your habit coach, I want you to live a life of ease, a life not bound or tied up in situations outside your control. Hence, today's habit comes as a principle for life. You must have an unwavering principle when it comes to lending money. This is something that I learned from one of our family friends, who's one of the wealthiest people in India. So you can imagine the number of people that would be coming to him asking for money. He will either give you money with a standard interest rate and a standard payback plan. Everything in black and white. The interest is, of course, lesser than the banks. But however, the interest rate adds that next level of seriousness. The other option is a blanket principle that you will never loan money to a friend or a family. No matter who it is, no matter how much, small, big, doesn't matter. It is very interesting when you give this clear, definite no, the person asking for money understands. If you have a wavering, unsure, let me think about it kind of no, that's when they take offense. Do not lend money if you do not know how to secure it. You worked hard for it. It is yours. They have no claim to it just because they are in need. And I know this sounds heartless, but this is true. You have to be logical when it comes to this. You can help them in other ways. You can support them in many ways. A loan does not have to be one of them. The final thing you can do is not loan money to them, but give money to them and not expect it back in return. You can add this money as your way of doing charity, but do not expect the money back. They may make promises to return, and if they do, it's a bonus. If they do not, no problem, you had already written it off. This way, you will only give away money that you do not need. So your simple habit when it comes to lending money starts by creating a definite principle. Decide you will never just lend money to someone. If you do, there will be an interest rate and a payback period. Or give the money away. Do not loan it away. Be very clear about the way you stand with regards to lending. Create these principles in life. They will support you for a long time going forward. Don't live in stress. It is so unnecessary.
You can tune in to the full episode on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Time for a short break.
पेश खिदमत है आपकी शान में हमारे अंजुमन से. Hi, I am Sadaf.
And I'm Arshit. खाने का इतिहास, economics, policy, psychology, सब है मेन्यू पे.
Only on the Naan Curry podcast every Wednesday. सिर्फ IVM podcast app या वेबसाइट पर या फिर जहां से भी आप अपने पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो.
Ruckus Avenue Radio.
Welcome back. While it may be spring in most of the world, in India it's election season. 5 states will witness legislative assembly elections soon, and the hottest battleground is West Bengal, presently governed by the Trinamool Congress and headed by Mamata Banerjee. Mahrukh Inayat, journalist and author, in her podcast The Note, brings some ground reports and tries to estimate which way the wind seems to be blowing.
Hello, welcome and Khushamadid. You're listening to The Note with me, Mahrukh Inayat. 5 states are going to the polls in less than a month. And just like every other state elections, the results will have ramifications both for the state as well as the center. Of the 5 states, I'm going to talk about West Bengal today. The last episode of The Note, if you remember, focused on the Congress party and specifically on Rahul Gandhi, and why and how these elections and the results will also be a verdict on his leadership skills and the position he enjoys within the Congress party. He has enough to worry about. Now coming to West Bengal. For the uninitiated, West Bengal is ruled by the Trinamool Congress, or the TMC, and this party is led by the fiery Mamata Banerjee. Now in the fray in West Bengal are 3 fronts essentially. One is, of course, Mamata's TMC. The second is the left, who, by the way, ruled West Bengal for decades, now in an alliance with the Congress party and the controversial ISF, which is actually led by a cleric. And the third one, of course, is the BJP. The BJP in the last state election of West Bengal won only 4 seats. And the reason I mention this is because the claim being made by the party, by the BJP, is that they will oust Mamata this time. Which means that the BJP, in order to get a clear majority in the state assembly, they need to win nearly 150 seats this time. That's a really tall order. Now, why do I feel it's advantage Mamata Banerjee this time? Number one, there is really no direct competitor to Mamata. This is being seen as a direct competition between Mamata and the BJP for many. The Congress might not like it, the left doesn't like it, but it is. It's actually translating into Mamata versus the BJP. Let me correct that. It's Mamata versus the Prime Minister. Mamata versus Modi. This means the BJP has no chief ministerial face and is working on the premise that Modi's popularity will swing the voters. It might have worked in Uttar Pradesh, but is unlikely to work in Bengal because Mamata continues to enjoy significant popularity. She's a 2-time chief minister already, and in state elections, voters traditionally want a chief ministerial face, one that they connect with, and Mamata has oodles of that. 2. The electoral makeup of West Bengal. Now, one needs to understand what is the electoral breakup of the state. 30% of West Bengal's population is Muslim, and by BJP's own admission, the Muslims don't vote for the party. So now the BJP needs to focus on the rest of the 70%, of which many Hindus are already supporting Mamata. Now, while the BJP is making every effort, and it's been successful to a certain degree, to polarize the narrative, to again make it Hindu-Muslim or Hindu versus the rest, it still is an uphill battle to convert into the required number. Imagine this, of the 70% Hindus, the BJP has to win 60% of the votes in order to get to the magic figure in the West Bengal Assembly. Now, Mamata, on the other hand, enjoys the support of the Muslims, that is 30% of the population, give or take a few percentages. And then, of course, she has sway over a significant number of the Hindu percentage of the votes. So that's an advantage for Mamata there again. Number 3, organizational base. Ask any psephologist, for a party to win an election, it is the strength of their cadre and their grassroots network. Now, the Trinamool Congress has managed to establish a strong network across the length and breadth of the state. And on the other hand, while the BJP, along with the help of several RSS affiliates, have also grown and spread, they still cannot match up to the TMC grassroots strength. And that is a huge advantage for Mamata. Number 4, there's no visible anti-incumbency. Of course, there are murmurs of protest against the Mamata Banerjee government. There are cases of corruption that are being brought out. And even though Mamata has completed 2 terms, it is not apparent whether this anti-incumbency factor has set in completely. The turnout at her rallies, for one, and the word on the street in West Bengal is that our fiery Didi has the love of the majority of Bengalis. Now, of course, this can completely change in what is going to be a long election in West Bengal. Finally, optics. While the BJP is using its social media machinery and its electioneering machinery as effectively as they always do, and I pretty much think they have controlled the narrative throughout this election, there was a recent incident in which Mamata Banerjee got injured. Now, I call it an incident because the TMC said it was an attack. The BJP said she's blowing it out of proportion. Anyways, that has injured Mamata Banerjee and relegated her to a wheelchair. Now, she is determined. She is the queen of optics. She knows how to utilize a setback. And if this injury can be called a setback, then she is utilizing it and using it to the hilt. She plans to campaign in that wheelchair, and that optic, that photo op, which the BJP always loves, they love photo ops. Well, Mamata is using this, and the sympathy card is definitely going to be in her favor. So yes, my money is on Didi. I believe this is going to be a bombshell of an election. Having said that, whatever be the outcome, this election is the high-stakes game. And for a student of politics like me, it offers great insight into how parties operate, how narratives are formulated, and how elections are won. But in the end, voters can always manage to surprise you. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the beauty of a democracy.
You can find us on the IVM app, website, or your favorite podcast player. And last but not least, on All Things Policy, Manoj Kevalramani and Rohan Sheth and Pratik Wagre talk about Google's proposed standard to target ads to aggregated groups of users based on their browsing history and the data privacy issues associated with it.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kevalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Pratik Wagre and Rohan Sheth. And we're going to be talking about the changing nature of web advertising, or the potentially changing nature of web advertising, with talk about Google now wanting to do away with third-party cookies and how that impacts you and I from our privacy point of view, how that impacts advertisers and the rest of it. So we're going to try and unpack all of this over the next 20 to 30 minutes. So firstly, guys, welcome to this conversation.
Hello.
Hi, Manoj. Okay, so I want to start with you, Pratik. Firstly, tell me, let's sort of unpack this, okay? Because this stuff can be really, really strange for people who don't really know about it. And I mean, even people in the field often don't really know about how some of these systems work. So let's just first unpack this idea of web advertising. Apart from it being terribly annoying, because you're constantly bombarded with stuff on your web page every time you open up, how does web advertising work? How do advertisers decide whom they want to target, why they want to target, what are they sort of looking at? Because there are times where I wonder that I've thought about diapers and I start getting a diaper ads on my browser. So how does all this really work?
Yeah, fair enough. So let's start it. So there are three main entities you should consider. The first is the advertiser, which is basically brands that want to advertise to you, right? The Nike trying to sell you shoes, your local neighborhood store trying to sell you something, etc. Right? Then you have your publishers, which is essentially any website that a user accesses, right? It can be a news website, it can be a blog, it can be anything, right? Now, what these publishers do is on their pages, they have places that they can display ads to anyone who comes and visits them, and that's typically called inventory, right? And what a publisher is essentially trying to do is sell that inventory, all right? And then now let's come to the third party, which is the user, which depending on which analogy you prefer is either the raw material or the product, and that's people like you and me going about our business on the website. So let's set us aside for now and come back to the publisher and the advertiser. So as I said, the publisher has inventory which they're trying to sell. Right? And why do they do that? Because they want to make money, obviously. Now, there are a couple of ways they can do this. For large publishers, yes, they can potentially enter directly into deals with brands to say that, okay, I'll display your advertisement on my banner or on so and so part of my page. Right? But that's not an option for the overwhelming majority of publishers on websites. So then what they try to do is to sell that inventory and target users specifically based on their interests. And this is what now gives rise to this whole field of ad tech, right? It's a deep industry with a lot of different moving parts. So while we won't get into all of these specifically, there's an interesting inventory, industry landscape document that Lumascape puts out. So we'll put a note we'll link that just to get a sense of how complex this entire ecosystem is. But what this entire ecosystem is trying to do is trying to figure out which is the best ad to show a particular user. Right? Now that then goes and creates incentives of trying and tracking users, understanding everything they're doing, getting a sense of what type of websites they visited, etc. All to then show them an ad in real time, right? Which is the first time as soon as I come to a page, it will then immediately spark off an auction where different advertisers or different exchanges that advertisers tend to work through will bid into that. Okay, so saying that, okay, I will pay so much for this inventory to target this particular user, right? And then the winning bid ultimately displays that ad on the page. And the beauty of this ad tech industry is that it's extremely complex. It gets reported on as a trade beat extensively, but we don't see a lot of these conversations breaking through into mainstream coverage, which is really surprising given how much of an impact it has, right? I think we've all come to the acknowledgement that the way platforms work, their business models are at the core of a lot of problems. And despite that, this entire industry doesn't get the type of attention or coverage in the mainstream press that it should.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, there's very little reported about this. There's very little discussed. And it's fascinating how rapidly this data is crunched, how rapidly then these bids, like you're explaining, happen, and how often it can be incredibly, it can be incredibly poorly targeted also. This is just me talking based on some of the ads that I end up seeing based on my search history. But it can also be really, really just the rapid nature of purchases from certain places, or just a look at something can then generate certain kinds of ads. And if you're a little bit careful about the kind of ads that you're seeing online when you're browsing, you end up realizing where this is coming from and why this is coming from. So no, it's fascinating. I agree. I think there should be a lot more examination of how this industry operates.
And that's actually a way, what you touched on, right, about the effectiveness. That's actually an open conversation that keeps popping up every now and then in terms of how effective this really is, right? And there was recently a very interesting book called The Subprime Attention Crisis, which sort of compares this to the subprime financial crisis of 2008, right? And it talks about how attention has been commoditized, and how these ad markets have so much opacity, and and people operate on such skewed incentives that it's creating a bubble that's waiting to explode or burst, right? But why that matters is because for all the ills of the advertising model, right, it is what has heavily subsidized the growth of the internet. The internet as we know it today would not have happened if it wasn't for the ad supported model taking off the way it did. So interestingly, Ethan Zuckerman calls it the original sin of the internet.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Rohan?
Hey, I want to add a little bit about Google's place in this ecosystem. So as Pratik has said, advertising is a pretty complex ecosystem, and I'll just give you a little example of how this thing works. This is also in my newsletter called Hand Me the Paper. I think everyone here saw that coming. But basically, let's say you have an advertiser, right? Like Ford, who wants to advertise on a news website, like let's say The Print, right? So Google connects Ford and The Print through this place called an ad exchange. So for large advertisers, this place is called AdX, right? So Ford uses an ad buying tool to connect to the exchange. On the other side, The Print connects to the exchange using an ad server tool. And before The Print's website finishes loading, you've got an ad buying tool and ad server tool interacting on an exchange. And before you know it, you're looking at a Ford ad in case you're looking to buy a car, Manoj, in case those are the ads that have been targeted to you. And the problem here is Google sort of owns the ad buying tool, it owns the ad server tool, it owns the exchange on which these transactions are taking place. It also owns the browser that generates cookies that sort of help make these transactions possible. So that is sort of where we are at right now. And all of this advertising ecosystem is just dominated in every sense of the word by this one company, and also there's Facebook. So yeah.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about two of the things that you've mentioned, right, Rohan, which is Google and its role, and of course, cookies, which is where I began this conversation with. And I want to first try and, because a lot of people will obviously know what cookies are, but a lot of people will not know what cookies are, but they would have definitely heard of them, because as you're browsing, you keep getting asked the question for permission often at different places. So I want, Pratik, you to first explain to me what exactly is a cookie in this online parlance.
Yeah, okay. It's a very, so it goes back to the early days of the internet, right? Now a lot of the internet as we know, or as it functioned back then, was stateless in the sense that it doesn't remember what to do, right? You come to a website, you open a page, there's no concept of a login, it has no idea who you are, you just consume information and you go away, right? Over time there was a need to start then identifying people coming back, what they did on websites, and that sort of thing. And that's essentially where the cookie came in. It was essentially basically a text file that stored information about you and what you did on the website, right? In its earliest form, it was meant to be on a particular website. And of course, over time, people also realized that it can be used to track what you do across websites, right? And that's where the third party cookie came in. And a lot of the advertising industry is then built off the use of this third party cookie, which is not just tracking what you do on one particular website, but tracking it across a whole bunch of websites, right? A very interesting example of this is, so if you go to typically most news websites, right, news publication websites, if you scroll to the bottom of an article, they all have this Taboola Outbrain box, right? Which is then showing you some very suspicious content from different parts of the internet, right? And so that's an example of a third party cookie. It's tracking you across different websites, then trying to serve content to you, right? Whether it's ads in the traditional sense, or in this specific example, it's trying to push you towards content to another publisher's website, right? Who will then probably be paying Taboola Outbrain for incoming traffic that they get.
Okay, so it's essentially something where it's documenting what I'm doing on different websites, and like you said, even sort of third-party basis, and then it's sort of trying to direct me based on what my preferences are and how another provider or an advertiser can target their content to me, and this sort of serves that purpose. I mean, it sounds fairly. I can see the problems obviously with cookies and why we need to eventually give permissions to sort of record some of this data. But why is there the privacy sort of aspect of this is quite clear, right? I mean, it depends on what exactly you're tracking, how much data you're gathering, and what sort of profile you can build of me as an individual. But and I'm sure you can explain to me a little bit more about the privacy aspect of it. But I want to understand, often now when we browse websites, we get asked for consent. Websites will ask you, right? That we store cookies, blah, blah, blah. Do you agree to it? 99.9% of the times, and I'm probably being a little, generous here by saying 99.9%. I think it's really 100%. People don't really even read that and they just say accept.
Yeah.
And you go ahead and say whatever you want to store, because the understanding is that you're anyway going to do it, or somebody's anyway going to do it. So, and I need this content, so I don't really care. So, firstly, what sort of privacy implications are there? And secondly, is this idea of informed consent, any of this in this context, even valid? I mean, from an individual's point of view.
Can I take that?
Sure.
I think there's a few things that I would like to say here. The first one is I think Prateek's made this distinction well, but let me just add on to it. So there's three kinds of cookies, right? There's the first party cookie, there's a second party cookie, and the third party cookie. Right? First party cookies are basically data collected by the website that you're visiting, right? So if you're on Wall Street Journal, let's say, the Wall Street Journal will collect data about what you're doing on the website and how many clicks you've made and so on and so forth. Second party cookies are transferred from one company to another company through some sort of data partnership. And the third party cookies are collected by advertisers and so on. So this is typically what your ad blocker is going to block is your third party cookies.
Catch the full episode on the IVM app, website, or your favorite podcasting app. We hope you like what you heard this week. And remember, check out our website, ivmpodcast.com, for more amazing shows. And don't forget to follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for tuning in. We wish you all a great week ahead.
Ruckus Avenue Radio.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
IVM.